Yeah, welcome back, everyone. This was Envy, the musical introduction of Envy. And now we have Catherine Newmark with us. Please welcome her.
Hello. Thank you. I am delighted, obviously, to be in such illustrious company. Small caveat, I did do quite a lot of emotion research in a previous life, but I have for these last 10 years mainly been working as a journalist. So please bear with me if you find this somewhat superficial. I must admit, though, that it has been fun to immerse myself again in all of these emotion theories, in the question of the terminology of passions, and I think the question that David Constant brought up, which at least evoked in me, the age-old question of how coherent is what we actually call emotions. I mean, how do these phenomena relate to each other? One of the main questions I was interested in at the time. Now, since everybody is starting with an anecdote, let me start with one as well, because we do advance in age and we remember history. So this anecdote stuck in my memory these last 20 years and is probably highly imprecise, memory being what it is. But I think the central point is probably true. While a student in Paris, I, for some reason that escapes me, attended a conference of the International Association of Women Philosophers that was held in Zurich at the time, in October of 2020. I remember admiring from afar a host of tenured female philosophers. The role model question was still very much alive and kicking at the time. And I remember Hilge Landwehr, who later became a professor here at the FU, at the Freie Universität, and a very good colleague of mine, holding a talk about Gefühle und Urteilskraft, feelings and the faculty of judgment. I don't remember details, I probably didn't understand them at the time, but I do remember that her claim that feelings and the faculty of judgment are closely related and that feelings play a major role when we use our faculty of judgment was met with a whole lot of skepticism, almost to the point of ridicule. I remember this so vividly because it was an attitude that I would later encounter myself, for example, when I undertook to do a somewhat gender-sensitive reading of Aristotle in front of an auditorium of elderly male classicists, and present company, of course, excluded. It's not so much an attitude of malevolence as simply one that is a little bit baffled and instinctively critical of the new approach offered. The point of this anecdote is thus that as recently as the year 2000, that is within my own living memory, propositions about the role of emotions that we have since come to take for granted were still considered quite outlandish, even in the context of a gathering of female and often feminist philosophers whom you would think of as having open minds. Now, I am speaking of German academia. The Anglo-Saxon world was somewhat ahead of us at the time. It's still might be, and I believe other humanities as well were probably a little bit ahead of philosophies. We are, after all, the guardians of that little owl of the Minerva that only flies out at dusk. Now, if one did not know one's history, one might be tempted to tell this story as that of a linear progress, as in philosophy has always been the business of rationality, and only recently have we come to broaden our horizon and to engage systematically with emotions. But I don't believe even the most ahistoric, systematic, and normatively oriented of philosophers would fall into this fallacy. It is quite obvious that philosophical engagement with emotions has a much longer and older history. It does, however, seem to be the case that philosophical interest in emotions waxes and wanes, that it is, in other words, something that periodically appears and then also disappears. And in fact disappears to the point that taking emotions seriously will discombobulate an entire auditorium of up-to-date philosophers in the year 2000. Now, since my inclinations in philosophy have always tended to be historical, I have always found this fact in itself quite interesting, that given we can assume to a degree that the anthropological fact of emotions is relatively invariant throughout historical times, philosophical interest in emotions, philosophical debate about the emotional nature of human beings can have such peaks and troughs. And I find it interesting that these ebbs and flows in the attention given to emotions are, like anything else really in the realm of theory, not just connected to internal developments of philosophy and science, but to broader political and social landscapes. So when and how do things get emotional? Let me run through a few exemplary historical moments. One first major instance is quite obviously ancient Stoicism. While Plato and Aristotle are somewhat interested in passions, and we do have accounts of them, actually they establish, as you all know, incredibly influential models of how to think about the passions that will be used more or less up to Descartes. They are not majorly concerned by them, it seems. Plato is out to find ideas, and Aristotle would like to understand nature. Emotions are a fact, fitted neatly into the theory of the human and into moral philosophy, but they are hardly the central or main concern. The Stoics that flourish from the 3rd century BC onwards, on the other hand, seem to be almost boundlessly fascinated and troubled by emotions. Stoic philosophers in Hellenistic times especially seem to be very concerned with the question of how to deal with these perturbations of the soul that trouble the equanimity that they seek. They compile lists of the passions, the passiones animae pathetes psyches. They divide them into good and bad passions. They develop technical guidelines of how to control them. They deal extensively with the fact that the emotions are in fact cognitive, they are judgment. It just happens that they are particularly bad judgments that need to be eradicated from the soul, ideally. Why this rigor, one might ask? Well, somewhat counterintuitively, of course, because Stoicism is a strongly rationalist endeavor, and Stoics therefore wish to find precise ways of putting to bed this unfortunate element of the human condition that is our emotional nature. And to be fair, to a certain degree, all moral philosophies that are eudaimonic in nature, that is, that are centrally concerned with the question of happiness, are interested in the psychological conditions of obtaining said happiness. And for the most part, philosophers, for reasons known to them, do not believe that happiness lies within sensuality. Hence, a somewhat troubled concern with emotions as an unreliable element of ourselves. So there are, of course, reasons within theory itself, but the strong focus on emotions and the all-out anxiety that one finds in the Hellenistic Stoics does also lend credence to the assumption that an element of this might be a reaction to societal changes and to feelings of loss of control. After all, the Stoic ideal of the sage, who is wholly independent of all outer circumstance, does beg the question of why this is seen as so important. And of course, there is much to be said about politically turbulent times and the need for control. As a philosophical school that was developed in Hellenistic times after the decline of Greek democracies, Stoicism, much like Epicureanism, Pyrrhonian skepticism, and other Hellenistic schools of thought, has a strong tendency towards inwardness, which I think is well explained within the broader context of the decline of democratic political structures and thus civic chances of political influence in 3rd century Greece. Isaiah Berlin famously called this the retreat to the inner fortress. I find it plausible to assume that feelings of political loss of control lead to a focus on the inner self. I think examples of this can be found up to the present day in quite striking ways. However this may be, what is clear is that the Stoic account of the passions, as you certainly all know, becomes a major influence for almost all later philosophies of emotions and up to the present day. I am now elegantly going to skip Christian thought and Christian love, and in a tried and true fashion, though of course with an incredibly silly philosophical fashion, I'm going to skip most of the so-called Middle Ages and look at another important moment of interest in passions, the one that begins in the late 16th and 17th century and runs through quite a lot of the 17th century. It all begins with the revival of Stoicism in the late 16th and early 17th century. Europe is ravaged by religious wars, and the idea of an inner fortress becomes attractive again. Based on humanist philology with its many new editions of classical texts, thinkers such as the Dutch Justus Lipsius popularized the idea of Stoic emotion control again. According to Lipsius, you should rather than flee the ravages of war, avoid your own emotional reactions to these horrors. Which, by the by, is one of the many reasons why the Stoics, at least in this early modern iteration, earned the epithet of philosophes cruels. While, interestingly, these outward circumstances may be paralleled with Hellenistic turmoil, an added element here lies in philosophical tradition itself, or more precisely, the newly strong humanistic interest in philology. Lipsius doesn't just write on the horrors of war and the necessity to emotionally cope, he also edits and translates the works of ancient Stoics. He is, interestingly, after Erasmus and Muret, the third humanist to translate Seneca in a span of about 70 years. And he adapts their insights to his time. There is an interesting shift that I cannot get into from the idea of constantia to the idea of consolatia, somewhat softer and more Christian or more compatible with Christianity idea of the Stoic sage. Even more interestingly, I find the actual high point of this particular phase of emotion philosophy lies not so much in this neo-Stoic revival itself, but rather in the reaction to it. Indeed, the revival kicks off more than a century's worth of debate about the nature and the status of emotions in the human being. Most major thinkers of the 17th century engaged extensively with the emotions, from Descartes to Hobbes and Spinoza, and all of them insist that they are quite original in their treatment of this question. While this is not exactly true in the sense that they are all indebted to Stoicism in a major way, it does point to another interesting element of this renewed focus on emotions, the growing dissatisfaction with received forms of philosophy, with scholastic rationalism being perceived as having gone stale to a degree. So there is, so to say, a revolution within the theory itself. Most 17th century thinkers clearly find Stoic condemnations of the passions to be too rigid. Descartes explicitly declares that he is not of those philosophes cruels who want their sage to be emotionless, and he, as also Hobbes and Spinoza, is very adamant that his take on the emotions is a purely scientific one, psychological, based on a research into nature, on the nature of the human being. It is, however, the moralists of the age, aristocrats such as La Rochefoucauld or Christina of Sweden, who see the Stoic heritage most critically. Getting rid of one's passions doesn't only seem unrealistic, it also would make life unbearably insipid. Descartes, who corresponds with Christina of Sweden before he joins her famously at her northern court and almost immediately dies of a cold, admits in his Traité des Passions that passions are what gives life its taste and its sweetness. Christina herself, in her moralistic works Ouvrage du Loisir and Sentiment, is even more explicit, not only in her praise of the passions, but also in her criticism of Stoic philosophy. Cette tranquillité tant vantée des philosophes est un état fade et insipide, a bland and insipid state. Les passions sont le sel de la vie qui est insipide sans elles, so passions are the salt of life. It is from this type of criticism of the Stoics that it, as not just cruel but also incredibly boring, that philosophies of sensual happiness that become more prevalent in the 18th century seem to spring. Madame du Châtelet, the eminent philosopher and physicist, who for some reason, on which I will refrain from speculating, is mainly remembered by history as Voltaire's lover, develops a full-blown emotion-based theory of happiness in her Discours sur le bonheur in the 1740s, where she claims that the only way to happiness is to have a very fully developed sense of one's own passions. I will spare you a number of quotes here. To sum up, in a way, the 17th century as siècle des passions can be seen as the attempt to deal with Stoic theory It begins with a rereading of Stoicism as consolation in a messy world ravaged by war, but it develops within courtly culture, I think, into a genuine search for the sweetness of passions. What I think is quite clear from reading 17th century debates is that emotional moments are not necessarily marked or characterized by a positive appreciation of emotions. They might also be marked by a strong rejection of emotions, or more likely by robust debate about the nature of the passions, which ones might be good or bad to have, and how much we should really suppress or control them. So what I have tried to show here with this example of the admittedly notorious siècle des passants is that an emotional moment can last quite a while and go through quite a lot of stages, and I think this parallels our present moment in a way. While all these debates are still beholden to an eudaimonistic conception of ethics where the question of emotion is mainly a moral concern, they can also be seen as precursors to the increasingly common view of emotions as a psychological part of knowledge more than will. In the 18th century, emotions will certainly shift inwards and be seen as problems not just of moral philosophy and of moral or immoral actions, but as a possible problem in view of their hold on our faculties of knowledge and knowing. And this is, of course, something that will also play a major role in our present moment, where there is a marked interest in the cognitive aspects of emotions in the revival that we have seen since roughly the 1980s. But before I move to this present moment, a few brief words on what happens in the roughly 300 years that I am again going to happily skip over. Emotions are, as an integral part of psychology, will never go away again, just as they were never truly gone, but the emphasis on them will come and go in ever shorter cycles, it seems to me. And with the replacement of eudaimonic ethics by deontological ethics, emotions will mostly, within philosophy that is, but also in the early empirical psychologies, leave the realm of morals and enter the realm of cognition. While I struggle to find in the 18th century any philosopher that does not, or any philosophy of psychology that does not include some account of emotions, the question of how important one finds them goes through quite a series of rapid changes, or pendulum swings, if you like. Each rationalist philosophy seems to be followed by a theory of feeling. Each endorsement of our emotional nature is reacted to by an emphasis on rational norms. To enumerate just a few of these pendulum swings as they concern the theory, and without delving too deeply into the doubtlessly interesting question of societal and political changes that frame them, maybe we can get to that in the discussion, moralistic sensuality is picked up and run away with by materialist libertins, French of course, to the rationalist ethics of early enlightenment, such as you find in Wolff or Leibniz, where happiness is exclusively reserved to the reasonable mind, the philosophy of moral sense, that is Shaftesbury and Hume, as well as the literature of sensibility, Empfindsamkeit, will answer with a resounding endorsement of our emotional faculties. Kant tries to mediate. Early bourgeois society is marked in its marked projection of the courtly cultivation of passion of the Ancien Régime, as well as romantic literature, initiates the cult of inwardness and authenticity that we are still subject to today. Hegel disapproves of this, and so on and so forth. In the 19th century, philosophy loses most of the extent of its traditional field of psychology, as well as most other sort of extended fields of research that are now being newly dealt with by the natural sciences, and in an increasingly desperate retreating battle refocuses itself on epistemology, with a little bit of ethics on the side. Thus, rigid scientism of the latter part of the 19th century has its philosophical counterpart in ultra-rationalist neo-Kantianism, with its almost exclusive interest in natural sciences that reduces the whole project of philosophy to pure epistemology. This in turn is countered by phenomenology, the first 20th century philosophical school of thought that extensively engages with how things feel and provides wide-ranging analysis of particular feelings and their qualities and roles in our lives. I should probably mention psychoanalysis as well. The world it does that in is, of course, a post-First World War Europe, hedonism after the catastrophe of the trenches, but also mass society and alienation and yearnings for some sense of purpose, rooted in physical and emotional experiences of belonging. Some of these philosophies of feeling transform their inward gaze into unpolitical positions or straight-out tyrannophilia in the face of fascism. After the trauma of totalitarianism and the catastrophes of the mid-20th century, and probably also under the impression of mobilization and incitement of mass emotions, post-war philosophy, post-Second World War philosophy, eschews the question of emotions for a few decades. Analytic rigor and analysis of language rules the day. The emphasis is on rationality, whether it be in normative ethics or in political ideas about rational debate and civilized discourse. Rational values possibly feel especially safe to those who would rather look forwards than backwards, where they might have to confront their own failures. Whereas, interestingly, of course, the Frankfurt School does engage with the darker sides of mass culture and authoritarian temptations. The renewed emphasis on emotions that begins our current emotional moment in philosophy has its beginnings in circa 1980, a bit earlier, 1970s, and stands firmly within the framework of the increasingly dominant analytical tradition, and is in its beginnings an engagement with the question of the mental states that are emotions. And while one of its early proponents, Amelie Oxenberg-Rorty, is influenced by Hume, moral sense philosophy, and ethical questions, there is a strong early and influential strand that is interested in the cognitive properties of emotions. Robert C. Solomon and Martha Nussbaum, for example, argue extensively for an understanding of emotions as judgment and for an appreciation of the rationality of feeling. And they do this, interestingly, again with reference to Stoic philosophy. There is indeed one very important part of Stoic emotion theory that I have not yet really dealt with here, the fact that it is extremely cognitivist. For the Stoics, emotions are judgment, and the precise problem of the emotions is that they are bad judgments. This wholesale condemnation is, of course, not shared by modern philosophers who strive to give more nuanced accounts of the role of emotions in their epistemologies and theories of action. More recently, academic philosophers have also re-engaged with the phenomenological traditions of the early 20th century and their extensive analysis of feelings. So to give this moment its contours, which is of course difficult because we are so close to it, while the neglect of emotions in post-war philosophy certainly had a strong political aspect, the starting point of the renewed interest in emotions certainly, much like much of 17th century debate, roots in a strong sense of dissatisfaction with tradition, with a rationalist type of philosophy gone stale, and with a wish for renewal. This is, after all, the age of emancipatory revisions of history. Emotions are highly gendered. At least they have been since the 19th century. I have argued that this does not necessarily hold true for earlier periods. And questions of gender, influential historical work on women, on gender and emotions certainly play a role. I remember reading the work of Barbara Rosenwein in my youth with rapt fascination. To some degree, the renewed academic engagement with emotions in our current emotional moment has been connected to progressive social ideas, I would say, such as feminism, and to a general progressive turn in culture. The integration of women into workspaces, say, into academia for that matter. Some have even called the emotional turn a feminization of society. But much like the 17th century moves from Stoic ethics in the face of war to psychological accounts of emotion within strictly rationalist philosophies to a celebration of sensuality, so also our present moment has gone So also our present moment, as it has gone on, has faced political and cultural and social changes in the landscape in which we engage with emotions, which I do think warrants some reflection. Our culture has, I believe, become increasingly emotional in both good and bad ways. Eva Menasse spoke about this eloquently last night. While it might have started out innocently enough with reality TV and its central tenet of performative emotionality, it has long since moved into the anger and resentment-driven culture of social networks, and into the all-consuming fake news and conspiracy theories, which, though in some ways hyper-rational, are probably best described as simply fulfillments of specific emotional needs, namely the need for control. Of course, academic discourse has reacted to this in numerous ways. Excellent work has been done on the passion triste of the moment, analysis of populist emotions, of rage, resentment, anger, politics, of contempt. Uffe Jensen and his Zornpolitik is just one example that I could mention here. But I do think there is more to be done. Since my talk has somehow arrived at the implication that every emotion moment in history is somewhat connected to the Stoics, let me hark back to them one last time. There is an element in Stoic emotion theory that is generally more present in older theories of emotions or passions than it is in present times. That is the idea of the cultivation of emotions. Even for the Stoics, dealing with those pesky and inconvenient passions does not exhaust itself in simply saying, don't have them or don't allow them to rule you. Rather, Stoic philosophy also contains quite a lot of interesting reflection on emotion management, on the cultivation of good emotions as opposed to bad ones. As an alternative to apathy, that is the eradication of emotions, Stoic emotion theory and ethics also offers the idea of oipateiai, or good emotions. These are defined as the reasonable versions of the pate, and conceptually it's not very clear how they are actually different from the pate. What they seem to be, is mainly a narrowing down of the emotional field. Diogenes Laertius enumerates the three main ones as being joy, caution, and willing, under which fall well-wishing or benevolence, friendliness, respect, affection, reverence, and modesty, delight, mirth, and cheerfulness. Interesting. So, if you look at what type of emotions these are, they are probably best understood as a sort of a restriction of the group of emotions that can be considered to be good or compatible with reason. They seem to be what one might in modern psychological parlance call low arousal positive emotions. Sweet and nice feelings, nothing too intense, nothing aggressive, no desires, nothing negative. Just universal goodwill, joy, and cheerfulness. Very new agey and touchy-feely sort of things. Now, this, of course, has found, to some degree, its way into the almost omnipresent discourse of therapy of our day. But this is just an aside, Stoic apathy, or serene and total emotional control, seems to flourish in self-help literature for managers these days, renewing the age-old question of whether Stoic emotion control is actually the heroic act of a rational and virtuous individual, or rather the natural go-to move of the emotionally suppressed male archetype. And just as an aside, it is to the degree to which the often female moralists of the 17th century make fun of Stoic ideals as rather bland and insipid and nerdy, is rather satisfying to the contemporary gender-sensitive mind. But I digress. To conclude, I would not like to leave you with the impression that in the face of our emotional age turning somewhat sour in the last decade or so, we should all remember the Stoic cultivation of the sweeter and finer feelings, or to strive to attain a more Zen attitude. We are justifiably wary of such notions, seeing as they often go hand in hand with exactly the type of political quietism that Stoics have been accused of these last 2,000 years. In modern self-help terms, just shut up and function within the system, however dysfunctional, work on your inner attitude. But I do think a renewed engagement with moral questions of appropriateness of feelings would be a good idea. As a society, we should care about the mechanisms of emotion cultivation that we install. Right now, and here I do fully agree with Eva Menasse, we seem to have established a very large and well-oiled machine for the cultivation of passion triste, of angry, aggressive, resentful, destructive emotions, in which we are all invested, not just the so-called Wutbürger or deplorables. And I'm afraid it's on this not very positive note that I end. I do not have any normative prescriptions beyond this. Thank you very much.
Sure, there'll be questions. We have Fritz Breithaupt.
Okay, even I can be short. Wonderful, thank you. And I love that it's always the Stoics, so you pulled them out of the hat at the end too. My question concerns now the contemporary situation. And following both Eva Manasse's talk, but also yours now, very strongly, I wonder whether we shouldn't differentiate two attitudes that focus on emotions. This is not against what you're saying, it might be pulling out something you also suggest. On the one side, an approach that wants to integrate emotions into rational practices. It's not rational versus emotion any longer, it's more like, as you said, emotions as judgments or Damasio's kind of feelings as guiding our correct decision making or good decision making. On the one hand, but then on the other hand, we have a kind of rhetoric of emotions that associates emotions as some form of veracity, truth claim, like the Me Too movement or Black Lives Matters came up, where you declare yourself as being vulnerable, you declare yourself as affected, and therefore demand something. So this rhetorical dimension. I wonder whether the two actually are quite separate. And so we have two different emotion cultures right now that often overlap, of course. But so I don't see that as quite as united, maybe, in the contemporary discourse. That's a question for you, of course.
It's an interesting question. I would need to think about it. I mean, instinctively with Spinoza, I would say it's still a passion triste. It's still a negative emotion, the truth-telling emotion. And that if in the context of the tradition of emotion theories, we should think about how productive passion triste can be. But then again, this is probably the philosophical paradigm of the call for action, the rejection of passivity, which has its own problems.
But there is this other side, this first side of just integrating things, which can be very positive. Like Martha Nussbaum has a lot of positive emotions in there. So that's why I'm just wondering about, we also have that very strong philosophical and psychological discourse. So I just...
But are you referring to? I mean, Martin, you mean a positive role for emotions, or just generally the sort of the emotional field being more tending towards the positive emotions?
Okay, I would even say both, but I meant the first one. But I do believe there's more positive emotions in contemporary age now too. Every discussion always goes to Twitter as the negative social kind of platform. Most other ones focus on the positive. Twitter's data are just available, so we kind of see it more. And journalists see it more, so therefore everyone talks about it. But that's a different discussion. I didn't want to go there.
I'll think about it. Maybe I'll come.
Next up is Valentin Gröbner.
Thank you. From an historian's perspective, it would be interesting to look at moments in which a recodification of desired emotional conduct took place. And Barbara will surely come up with more examples, but the appearance of the new male ideal of the gentle man might offer interesting models for reintroducing civility, restraint, politeness into a society on the level of powerful cultural tropes. Another example would be coolness.
Yeah.
The restraint. A couple of years ago, I listened to a wonderful talk by Dietrich Dietrichson about the invention of coolness in the black American popular culture in the 40s.
Yeah.
So when we look for models of overcoming or of countering infectious, rude behavior, there would be quite a repertoire. And I wonder if, coming back to mixed emotion and coming back to some elements of your talk, I wonder if we could agree here on a certain framework of describing the politics of self-victimization, which would enable us to describe more fully certain quasi-automatic procedures of reproach, counter-reproach, etc. Because a lot of the things going on in political discourse in the last month seem to be a contest of self-victimization from different groups with different instruments. And in order to be less helpless against it, a couple of analytic instruments might be useful. It's more a comment, anyhow.
No,
beautiful
I would like
talk.
to just, if I may comment,
it just gave me ideas.
I do think the self-victimization point is interesting. I struggle, however, to account for it somehow within the frame of emotion theory entirely. I do want to say something about gentlemen and cool kids. Archetypically speaking, I said that emotions are not necessarily gender-coded before the 19th century. I think this holds true if you look at explicit sort of are they male or female questions, but they are until the 17th, 18th century. They are just all the examples for emotion are taken from a purely male universe, so they are implicitly male-coded. I mean, we're talking. I mean, in philosophy, the main. I mean, I'm probably.
Look, I'm a medieval historian by training, and the most powerful orchestration of emotional synchronization took place from the 14th century to the 16th century by the mendicant preachers in Central Europe. Male specialists preaching in the vernacular with an enormous range of multimedia gimmicks, images, exploding figures, precisely for producing emotions, very strong emotions of fear, loss, threat, to moralize large male and female urban audiences.
I mean, I don't doubt that. This
is something else than
my vision
than
is narrow because I look at philosophical texts and at the conceptualization of what passions are in the context of the theory of emotions, which is a philosophical tradition. So you are surely right for something that is beyond that. But inside the philosophical tradition, it does seem to be, it's sort of anger, fear, the sudden fright when you encounter wild animals, stuff that happens when you go to war or or if you're hunting. So this seems to be the context of the examples that philosophers think about when they try to define emotions until sort of very recent times. And the sort of the gentleman, the sort of gentle early bourgeois sort of prototype is just historically relatively short-lived, as is the coolness ideal. I mean, I would think it's interesting to go there, but at least in sort of in what I look at as the history of tradition of theory, these codifications they are not inexistent, but they have a less strong sort of historical weight than the others. That is what I would say. But then maybe this is just my bias because everything's Stoic.
Everything indeed is. Christiane Voss.
Yeah, thank you. Two questions. How would you relate post-colonial readings to this Eurocentric reconstruction of history of philosophy of emotions? And the second question would be, how exactly does psychoanalysis fit to the overall mapping of your dialectical psychoanalysis?
Yeah.
How does that, the psychoanalytical models of emotions, how do they really fit to this dialectic of rational suppression of emotions versus irrational outburst of emotion and the adequate theories of it? Because the Oedipus complex, for example, seems to integrate already all kind of rational and irrational impulses into an all-over pattern of behavior that is not to be rejected in the light of any purified reason or rationality again. So in my point of view, psychoanalysis kind of stops this repetition of dialectic as you reconstructed the history of the philosophy of emotions and kind of seems to find another way out of this club.
I would agree with the latter point, but the first point, do you have anything specifically in mind for the post-colonial readings of sort of the history of emotion?
Now, if Achim Membe, for example, says that we cannot just project white history to non-historical to life patterns which are not included into the history, namely the black slavery, the history of black slavery, then they obviously need a kind of different story and different history.
Not obvious.
Or maybe it's a question. Maybe I don't know. I don't know whether you can, whether the Stoics would help. The reference to Stoicism would help to do that. Maybe, but I don't know.
I mean, the coolness debate is an interesting one because Stoics and coolness, there is a sort of an inner link there, and there has been all this work done on coolness, and it's sort of deriving from the black slave experience in America. So that is an interesting thing. I find it, I mean, I do think that one needs to do more global history of theories than we have traditionally done. I must admit that, well, this is a relatively new development and we're sort of all struggling to sort of catch up to that. I don't think it necessarily devalues the sort of research into ancient or specifically European context. It doesn't mean that this is not something that is interesting to pursue, but I do agree that especially the skipping over the Middle Ages and the sort of where the world is quite obviously more global than it is in a certain other periods of European history is a very typical sort of European philosopher move that is there is a very obvious critique to do of that.
Josef Rüchte.
Yeah. Thank you, Catherine. I guess we can sum up your presentation by saying in contemporary philosophical discussion we have two main strains. There are others, but there are two main threads. And the one is that goes, not directly, but that goes from the Stoic philosophy to, let's say, Martha Nussbaum, the cultivation and narrativization of emotions. The other one is the one from Spinoza to Etienne Balibar, Antonio Negri, Gilles Deleuze, and Guattari, affect theory. And that kind of theory and that tradition is, on the theoretical level, responsible, I would say, to what Eva Menasse yesterday called das eitle Ich, the vain ego, the ego that is always feels always humiliated. the background, the theoretical background, is affect theory. So that's my summary of your talk. I'm not sure.
That's an interesting thing, because I would not strictly separate Spinoza from the sort of the general Stoic debate of the 17th century, but I generally do not differentiate until the 17th or early 18th century between affects and passions. I don't think there is a sort of a conceptual difference, but I mean, Spinoza would not approve of this type of affect theory.
But the reinterpretation Deleuze and others gave him, and this is from the beginning a political reinterpretation of Spinoza.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense to me. And yes, thank you.
Right. Next up is Rüdiger.
Yeah, I would love to have a follow-up to the coolness discussion yet, but I don't do that because one reason is we had a whole conference years ago, which was called Apatheia, Besonderheit, Coolness, on different forms of restricted feelings. And anyway, first of all, I would like to say that I'm very glad that, I have to confess, I forced you a bit into this presentation. When we talked about it, you said, well, I don't know whether I can deliver a whole talk about it. And now I'm very happy that you did, because you said, well, you are a bit out of academia and now in a different field. And I think this is the possibility to have this bird's eye view you had here. And I'm very glad we have this, because sometimes I think all about interdisciplinarity sometimes needs intermediators to have the possibility to just step back and have a look on different fields. And very often I thought about our own work here at the Einstein Forum in a way, in a very different, a very similar position as you have. But this to start with. My point now is to the content of your talk. I would like to maybe have a little word for a dropout in the history of philosophy of emotions, and that is Thomas Hobbes. And if your arguments for Stoicism and the continuation over and over again of revivals of Stoicism, what is about the you said that more or at least one interesting point is the answers to Stoicism at some time, and so I would like to ask you if you maybe might underestimate a certain group of answers to this Stoicism, because if you just look at Descartes, for example, this Passion de l'âme is a very odd book, because 90% of mechanistic philosophy about the details, how but anger or whatever works within ourselves, and then the 10% of moral reflections, which is completely Stoic. And then you have the alternative to this, and the alternative is is Thomas Hobbes, who tried to reformulate the whole thing completely mechanistic. Not only what is de corpore, but also what is de sive. And then he had this balance of powers projected to the state, and that he needs a positive, which is a very negative feeling, fear, to balance the others. And this might be, very strangely enough, the beginning of the career of emotions as a positive force in the 18th century philosophy. How do you think about it?
Yes, well, first of all, thank you for the compliment. Somebody does have to have the courage to be imprecise, and it's normally the journalists in the room. And the other thing about Hobbes reminds me that, of course, I made an incredibly narrowing down, because the Stoics, I think they are so important to revivals of emotion theory, because they have this, there's this sort of such a strong condemnation of emotions that everybody has an opinion on whether they think this makes sense or not. But theoretically speaking, I don't think that Stoicism, conceptually speaking, is important at all through the centuries. It what is actually important throughout all of the Middle Ages and up to Hobbes, and then bleeds into the 18th century, is Aristotelism, the sort of passio, actio passio, the idea of striving, of the action and the passion. The first, sort of something is a passion in the soul and then becomes an action in the body. This is all Aristotelic psychology, which Hobbes turns. I mean, Hobbes is in a way much more than Descartes. Descartes is an outlier because he has sort of a theory of sentiment that is almost just like an impression. The passion is almost like a sense perception. It doesn't lead anywhere. He has difficulties to explain how it can lead to an action or to a sort of how it can motivate something. Whereas the old Aristotelic model has an extremely good, and Thomas does this in the sort of Middle Ages, and the 17th century thinkers, also Spinoza, do it. They have this idea, I get an outward impression, it moves my soul, and my soul in turn moves my body. This is the model. And so Hobbes, just like Spinoza, has a conatus, sort of a striving idea, and this is Aristotelian in its origin. So I think, theoretically speaking, on the conceptual level, Aristotle is much more important, but I do agree that what happens in these 17th century thinkers is sort of the pre-modeling of what then happens in the 18th century, that it somehow becomes not just a sort of a mechanistic sort of back and forth of interaction between soul and outer world. It becomes something that is inside the soul and that is authentically mine. And this is sort of the genuine sort of move towards a modern conception of feeling. But yeah, thanks. That's actually very important.
Next up is Rob.
Thank you for your talk. I'm particularly interested in the construction of historical narratives.
Yeah.
And so in your case, I'm fascinated by the gaps.
Mm-hmm.
And you were very explicit about the centuries you were leaping over. But I'm trying to kind of connect these gaps to your main claim about sort of cycles of interest, that there are peaks of certain philosophic interests that happen, say, here and here and here, and in between something else. And I wonder if those that cyclical argument or the something else argument goes away if you broaden the category of philosophy to include those who might have identified themselves as a philosopher, but have come down to us as something else. So, for example, the 19th century, which you can you can suggest that there is a overwhelming interest in emotions in the natural sciences, and most of those natural scientists consider themselves philosophers.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you look at the whole 19th century debate about control of emotions, gentlemanliness, equanimitas, it is all building on Smith and Hume and Kant, and you find it in Bell, and then in Darwin, in Spencer, in Wundt, in Bain, in William James. And it's profound. And that ends up in 20th century preoccupations with physiology, but in a way this is physiology being delivered in a philosophical bent. So I actually wonder if there's a sort of counter-argument instead of these cycles, that the continuity simply is more like a continuity, but it takes diversions.
I mean, it's of course it's a choice to speak of cycles, and it might just be sort of waves. And I do also agree that you can write the history of emotions. This is also what I was trying to do when I wrote my history of emotions, as a sort of a continuity of traditions. And everything you mentioned about the 19th century is obviously true, and I think that my claim was not that the 19th century is sort of terra incognita. There is, of course, my claim would have been that the cycles become shorter, or the peaks and troughs become smaller. But you could, of course, also say there's a broad stream of emotion theory, and it runs from antiquity to today. I guess what brought me to think about it in cyclical ways is the fact that our present emotion moment has such a clear beginning, or that we have such a clear experience of emotions not being part of philosophy for quite a few decades and then suddenly coming back. So this made me think of, do we have other moments where they're sort of kind of gone and then suddenly everybody focuses on them at the same time again? And that's what made me think of the 17th century, which is such a moment. But you can, of course, say they were never gone. They were also not gone in the 40s, 50s, and 60s of the 20th century. It just didn't seem to be the dominant sort of narrative that philosophy had about itself. And then you can also make the point, which I think is very pertinent, why have this narrow understanding of philosophy if obviously the philosophers I'm talking about in the 17th century are much broader intellectuals? Then why not take into account psychoanalysis and everything that happens in the post-war in dealing with the sad emotions of the traumatized war generations, which is not philosophy proper, but it is, of course, there's a lot of reflection on emotions. So yes, you're right. This is a narrative that I sort of was trying to think about if it makes sense, but there are a lot of reasons why you could say one should do it differently. But I find it interesting to try out different narratives.
It's provocative.
There's two more questions on my list, and I will ask you to keep it short. Now there's three more questions. Yes, first it's Christian von Strebe.
Yeah, thanks very much for your talk. I was wondering if there seem to me two things that have remained somewhat hidden, but they seem to me to be a very, very interesting observation. I'm trying to reconstruct them. I'd be interested in your opinion. So on the one hand side, what I took from your talk is that you're talking about the moral normativity and appropriateness or virtuousness of certain emotions, probably across society. And it sounded to me as if, there might have been some sort of time where there is some sort of consensus about these emotions, etc., etc. On the other hand side, you made a remark where you came up with the example of Epaminondas' talk yesterday, where you were talking, I think it was, you said something about the orchestration of emotions. I'm not entirely sure. What I made of this was the Epaminondas' example of social media running high on affect. In particular, high arousal, negative affect. And to me, it seems that there seems to be a strong distinction between contemporary societies on the one hand side being characterized across the board through the uses of things like social media, high affect, high arousal, negative affect, which is a signature of many, many discourses that are going on, while at the same time what we are seeing is an extreme fractionalization of the ideas of which are the right and wrong emotions. And they are fractionalized, in line with different identity groups, political positions, etc., etc. And that seems to be a particularly interesting constellation to me, and I would be interested if that is roughly what you had in mind.
I'll think about it. I mean, it seems an interesting observation to me, but I would have to, as I tend to say, I'd have to sort of think about how I would integrate it. But it doesn't seem incoherent with how I see the situation.
Now we have a question here. Nancy Carter?
Sure.
Yeah.
So I really appreciated the overview, and I speak as someone who studies not just the period you skipped, but also kind of a world you skipped as an Islamicist who works in the Middle Ages. But I agree with you, it's incredibly useful for me to sort of understand the way a narrative maybe can understand itself. So that was really, really enlightening, and I appreciate it. I guess I just wanted to ask sort of a general question, maybe it'll come out as a comment about where there's an analysis of power and how these narratives about emotion get constructed. And it maybe relates to the question about what can post-colonial studies offer to this story about the way emotions are working. And I guess it's just maybe a general call to maybe be attentive to what the emotions are doing in a particular context. Or questions of what we're doing as people who study emotion with the concept of an emotion. And when I say we, I don't really know who the we is necessarily. Am I talking about publics? Am I talking about corporations? Are we talking about governments, scholars, or demagogues? And I guess in this question of tracing through a tendency to wish to eradicate emotion, I would just want to be a little attentive to thinking about who gets to decide which emotions need to be eradicated, which things count as emotions. And it kind of corresponds to the question of relativizing versus universalizing, and who has a desire to relativize emotion as a way of undoing a false universal, which is to say we should eradicate these bad emotions, but we get to decide which ones count as bad and which ones deserve to be cultivated. And so in thinking about this broader story about how people felt about the need to revisit the question of should we tamp down on emotion, try to control emotion and manage emotion, I think it's very interesting to think about who's making decisions about why that's an important question, and which kinds of groups or people's emotions are the object of that tendency, not just the theorizing about it.
What is sort of the thing they're thinking about when they make these claims? But I think I like just to add to your comment on the universalizing tendency. I mean, I do believe that emotion theory from antiquity onwards and really to the present day has a problem with universalizing. There is this sort of a universalizing concept of the emotions, which there is. If you look at the examples that are giving, they're never coherent with the theory that is proffered. So you generally have, and I'm sorry, because until today, I think to a degree also in sort of psychological emotion theory, quite incoherent conceptual parts which are not coherent with the descriptive parts. So the universalization problem starts sort of even before you come to social power. I would add to that, yeah.
Catherine, my thanks as well for a really excellent narrative. I just wanted to question something that you said towards the end, not of your talk, but in response to someone else, about, no, the emotions never disappeared. Perhaps one could say that the emotions never disappeared from the narrative of the history of philosophy. Perhaps they were present in the 40s, 50s, 60s, etc. Could you name, in Anglo-American philosophy, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, early 70s, someone who talked about the emotions besides Wittgenstein and Stanley Cavell, who often were really considered not to be genuine philosophers because they did that? Or maybe did I misunderstand you?
So you're asking if I could name a philosopher from the 40s, 50s, and 60s in the Anglo-Saxon tradition who engages with emotions?
Except for Wittgenstein and Cavell, yeah.
No, I cannot. And I do not think that there are. I think the tradition is very clearly marked by not engaging with emotions. But I think there are other fields within which emotions are theorized. I mean, you can think of... Yeah, I mean...
Oh, yes, sort of.
But
I think this
okay,
game of name
I don't think the name dropping is, but I don't think it's...
No, I was just trying to understand you.
I think that it's more prevalent in other fields of the humanities in this time. That's what I was saying.
Because it struck me as a counterintuitive claim. Okay, thank you.
Well, I hope you join me all in thanking Catherine.